I'm sure we will now be ready to join our next conversation or discussion, as we can call it. What we're going to talk about is the next step in terms of data democratization, or you could say the foundation of today's data democratization strategies, which is data modernization. And the topic we are going to be talking about is incorporating timely, trusted, and enriched data for optimized AI performance. So there is going to be two aspects of this discussion. Basically, we are looking at data modernization in the context of how we are adding third-party data to our first-party data, as well as looking at other data sources to enrich our own data sets. We are also going to be looking at how this relates to AI performance, or all the concepts of building models out of algorithms. So in that conversation, we're going to have three panelists who will be joining us. First, and I'm going to attempt this, Philipp. We have Philipp Gschöpf, Director of Data Science at Prudential. Is that correct, Philipp?
Yes, and congratulations. I would say mission impossible achieved, even with the crazy spelling of the name here. So really looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you. We're going to have Xiu Yu Wu, data scientist, APAC regional lead at Zurich Insurance. And we'll be joined by Alan Chan, who is the Deputy Director, Head of Data Insights and Strategy at Greenpeace East Asia. So thank you, guys. Thank you, gentlemen. And thank you for your time. I'm sure we're going to have quite a number of things to discuss about. Maybe we can just start out by looking at data modernization from the context of enriching it with third-party data. People do that because they want to have a better view of their customers. And I guess the mantra nowadays is the golden record, or customer 360, which is what pushing a lot of these strategies forward. But in your experience, where are these third-party data sources currently, and what are the future third-party data sources that people need to be looking at? Maybe Alan, you can start out with that.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Winston. And hello, everyone. I hope you hear me okay. I think from my perspective, the so-called third-party data that usually being used, a lot of it probably coming from the social data perspective. And in terms of social data, I mean probably the social media data that would be shared by the social media users, including information like, for example, their location, their language spoken, some of the kind of, I guess, gender or preferences, that kind of stuff, which would be the data kind of valuable from a marketer perspective. That would help us to be able to target the right audience at the right time with the right content and that kind of stuff.
Okay, thanks, Alan. Maybe Philipp, you can add on to that.
I think it really depends on how far you want to push it in terms of external data as well, right? So obviously right now, what is the most successful model that we're seeing is the whole ecosystem model. And all the external data typically tends to become really powerful if you're able to integrate it into your own data ecosystem, right? And then obviously it becomes something that is part of your IP, and players like Google are extremely successful, right? Why is Google giving you free storage, free email address, all that? Obviously because that enables them to link all that data that they're seeing together. It doesn't mean that anyone is reading that data or something, but they can aggregate insights from that, going from the raw data to having as part of the ecosystem that attracts partners, as you called it, the golden standard of data, right? And then, of course, what really powers this is the quality and the type of the internal data, because it's all about linking up, being able to link up, right? If you're just going out and So I'm going to collect external data because data is oil. I believe it is valuable. Yes, it is, but it's only as valuable as the value you can create for actual consumers with it. So that merge becomes incredibly important, and you need to be smart, and you need to use the intelligence of everyone in the organization, of the grassroots, to figure out what is the data we should really be focusing on, because it's going to enrich our own IP. And certainly the internal data is really, really important for that. You have to bring your own house into good order before you can start to turbocharge it. And the internal learning loops are really, really crucial for that. Right? So that's the kind of pillars we're seeing with the really, really successful players especially in the ecosystem market.
Okay, and Philipp, I'll come back to you on that learning loops right after this. But to you, what are your thoughts on integrating third-party data? And Philipp actually alluded to a good point. Do we really look at all this before we get our own internal house in order, or could we do it together because we don't have the time to like sort of boil the ocean, as they call it?
Yeah, maybe I first speak from the perspective of insurance industry. So for insurance, we have life and P&C business. So this is quite a different story in these two different areas, I would say. For life business, you can expect that we want to build a long-term relationship with the customer, because talking life business, we are more like a lifetime relationship. So we are quite interested to see building a customer-centric profile. So every data point, like what you mentioned, like social media, psychographics data point, like lifestyle, I think all this will add a lot of the value into the product and the service we deliver the customer. So this is where I see the third-party data point will be very useful to build a more successful relationship with the customer. But for the P&C side of the business, we more focus on the risk assessment. So I would say that we already collect a lot of third data point party data point to try to do a better risk assessment. For example, we are talking about property insurance, we are talking about motor insurance. So we all know that we already have a lot of integrated data point. Otherwise, we can't really do a good, fair assessment on the risk. So, and also on top of that, I think there's one third-party data source we don't really talk a lot about. It's more like a benchmarking. Like Philipp mentioned, we have a lot of internal data points. For example, like we have a measurement of how the customer like or unlike our company. We will have some kind of rating, but we don't have some kind of market benchmark. So we will understand that how the customer rating change across time, year by year, or difference between different business operation you have in your country or your business. But we can't have that. But we tried quite hard to look for this kind of third-party data about the benchmarking, but honestly, we don't see too much around there. So typically, maybe we talk with some consultant firm, they will suggest some of the data point, but it's not really the typical third-party data point we are talking about. And sorry, I'm a little bit long on that. I also want to build something on top of that. Is I have a previous role working in a hedge fund, and in the investing area, we don't really call third-party data. We have a term called alternative data set. So this is a very interesting space, is that because in investing, you are more just look for the profit. So we don't care too much about how you really look into your data. So maybe, for example, like we want to invest in an e-commerce retail sector. So we will try to collect data on the sales volume in that platform. Like we are investing in a hotel. So we will try to understand how the hotel booking data point actually related to the performance. So I would say that in the investment space, the potential is much larger, but in the insurance space, I would say we are still quite slow in the progress.
Okay, and I'd like to dig deeper into the insurance. And Alan, don't worry, I'll come back to you on what Greenpeace is actually doing with those data. But insurance sector, a lot of their product models is actually built on the fact that you have a strong underwriting. I mean, most of your data scientists were actually actuaries, so you actually developed a lot of the data science. But underwriting is sort of going to be, it's sort of going through an evolution, right? Because essentially, a lot of this data that is being used to underwrite or create a risk assessment of each, as you're looking at micro insurance, and if you're looking at products that is going to be developed right at the life stage where a person really needs, then you can't really take the time to actually look at risk assessments to that context. to what extent then does third-party data come into the picture? Maybe Siyu, you can start, then I'll go to Philip.
Yeah, you touched on a very good point. So this is a very high motivation and high business value in this area. We always try to what we call personalize the underwriting risk. So we know that some of the customer may have a lower risk. So we want to have some evidence that we can see that the risk is lower, so we can charge them a lower premium. I think it's a win-win for both of us. But the problem here is that I think it's kind of related to data privacy. So when we collect third-party data, so we have to make sure that the third-party data point have the consent of the customer in order to. So yeah, Philipp is nodding. Yeah. So this is a very tricky part because everything go into this area is, I would say, more like an explore area right now. So we have a lot of regulation on how we can treat the customer data. We have GDPR, we have a lot of stuff, especially in insurance, which is a very highly regulated business. So I would say this is a very good understanding that we should go into that direction, but we are still don't know how we can really reach on the end, I would say.
Philipp, your thoughts?
Yeah, obviously this is supposed to be a kind of conflicting discussion, but I conclude quite broadly. Look, even if you would assume there would be no regulator whatsoever, I think we all agree that on an ethical standard, it's really important to be transparent, to know what data is being used, especially seeing that we're now talking about the underwriting process, which has two things. It's got extremely sensitive data, right? About my own health. It's something I wouldn't even tell people on the street, and suddenly I'm being asked to share this to a third party. And the second part of this is it has a significant impact on how the product is going to treat you, especially on the pricing side, right? So from that point, I really agree that that is a specific use case where if you use any kind of external data to enrich, you need to be extremely transparent on how it is. So we typically found there are ways to generate that data in user journeys that are kind of closed, right? One example is nowadays we can actually underwrite just by looking at someone's face through the phone's camera. And that's very interesting because actually you see up to the degree where you can look at how's the light reflected on the face. And the interesting piece now is that blood actually reflects the photons differently than flesh cells. So we can see how the blood is pulsing through your face, which then tells us, okay, what is the blood pressure? Are there any signs of any cardiac challenges? We can obviously tell everything that we can tell about a person. We can train AI to do it, right? If it can tell the difference between a cat and a dog image, it can also tell the difference between a young or old looking person. And it's kind of the truth, right? Some people, they age really well. So actually in that sense, it gives us the advantage also of saying, instead of relying on what's officially on the paper, if through your lifestyle, you actually achieve a much better risk, then I should acknowledge that, right? And really give that technology through that individualization, it really gives us a chance to revamp processes and make them much fairer as well, right? But yeah, for that specific use case, because it's so sensitive, it's challenging to have external data. And if you do so, I would highly recommend that you make it very transparent to the user and let them opt in at most of the stages.
Okay. Alan, coming to you in terms of data modernization and what Siyu and Philipp has been talking about, where in terms of very sensitive data, even if we call it as third-party or alternative data, from your perspective, how can companies take the right step forward? Should they actually look at a proper data modernization framework and strategy, or should they first of all look for the right platform that enables or that can actually define their strategy?
Good question. I think from my personal perspective, I would say technology is the enabler. So before you do that, I think there are certain business decisions you have to make internally. in terms of, what sort of data that we will be collecting or using, what are the purposes of those data, and also, more importantly, that the governance process being in place, that you do need a proper governance, whether it is third-party data or first-party data that the company actually collected, in order to move things forward. And of course, through that governance process, you have to consider the different regulations in different markets, and in some markets, I think the trend is moving towards more like a GDPR approach, where I think it's about, in layman's term, it's about giving the control back to the customer in terms of how they wish to their data being used in different instances. So it's about giving the control back to the customer. I think that's probably the trend of data privacy. Yeah.
Okay, and I'll come back to that question, because for me, one of the issues of GDPR is it enshrines the European concept of data privacy, which not necessarily is the same in Asia. But let's come back to that while you guys think about it. I'd like to hear from the audience as well. I mean, we're talking about data modernization. We're assuming that we have a lot of challenges, but what are the challenges that you face as our audience? And we'll have the first poll question to the audience, please. Yes, so essentially I want to know, what is your top challenge with data modernization? It could be everything down there on the list, but I would like to see what is the top one. Please do select. We'll come back to the results in 2 to 3 minutes time, but I'd like to now expand with Philipp on the learning loops. Could you explain a bit more on the learning loops and how data modernization actually plays to that?
Yeah, certainly. So think about what really constitutes an AI for an enterprise. Is it an algorithm, a really smart algorithm, the model? Intuitively, we would think, yes, it is. From a more business-driven side, even a legal side, is actually not. You cannot get an IP or a copyright on an algorithm, because that's basically almost is like research. What, however, you can get a copyright on, and now it gets interesting, is a combination of that algorithm, typically in a form that's trained towards a business use case, innovative business use case, together with some data that you have built partially, and a user interface that builds the entire user journey, plus the learning loop, where every time your model does make some recommendation, some action to be taken, it's essentially an experiment for the organization. And every time you should learn from that. The same way that when you go to Google and you click on a link, you improve Google. Your customers actually become the people that partially build the product here, right? So that's really, really crucial, because without this, if you don't have that learning loop, then what is the difference between new technologies in the deep learning space, or even AI as such, versus what we had 10s, 30s of years ago, where we did some automation with very basic IT procedures, right? The difference between that and AI is really that it's more robust, especially if the circumstances change, right? So that's why that learning loop is really, really crucial in building your data repository as well, right? It should over time actually become the main source of your data repository and actually the main value of your company, if you think about that, right? But before I was criticizing the concept of data is oil. Yes, it is only oil if you have the right kind of data, and that's typically the data that you can offer to your ecosystem partners that other people can't offer, right? And that typically comes through the learning loops.
Sure, thanks. And yeah, data is oil. Actually, it's crude oil. We need to process it, and that's where the magic happens. But to your point of learning loops, and I like to extend that to later on to CU, should we keep the human in the loop in these learning loops?
I would say it depends on what kind of use cases it is, right? Are you looking at a hospital where we're making life or death decisions? We've seen IBM has failed in saying AI can do it, because AI can do it, yes, but it is also having ethical considerations. And even if the AI is optimal, it still kind of slides on what we would call an efficiency frontier, and you can choose your preference, right? If you think one doctor might value really highly that he or she wants to reassure patients. So he tends to give less diagnosis, because telling someone that having cancer where they don't have it is not something nice. On the other hand, with that approach, you can sometimes miss actually diagnosing someone who really has something and ask them, could you come back in half a year when we have more certainty, right? So I would say there are certainly some use cases where you should think about having the human in the loop, that typically things that are low frequency, high cost, and where the ethical trade-off is really, really important, right? And then we have that trust of seeing, okay, there's another layer of control. On another kind of Goldilocks zone, you have the exact contrary. You have high frequency decisions. If you get it wrong a few times, it doesn't really matter, because you do so many decisions, the impact of every single one is so small. In that case, you could essentially say, okay, I don't really care about what the causality is. There's not much of a cost of the ethical trade-off. So I'm really fine with correlation. In that case, it doesn't make sense from a cost perspective, from a customer convenience perspective, to have a person in the loop, because that introduces latency in the user journey as well. We need to remember, it's not only the cost to us, it's also cost to the customer of waiting for a person to do something, right?
Thank you. And CU, could you expand on that?
Yeah, so I think I have a very good practical example from the financial side. So we all know that we have customer fraud. So we have to fight against customer fraud. So the way typically how we arrange is that we have some kind of, we can train some kind of model to do some fraud detection. It's easy, I would say. And then after we identify some high risk cases, we have to hand over to the fraud investigator to really understand, oh, is that a really fraud case or not? I think it's a much better model than we are just using a black box or whatever, the whole AI based process of doing fraud detection. I think it's a better way, because at least we will have a responsibility back to the people actually to see, okay, this is a real fraud case or this is not a fraud case.
Okay, I'd like to, before I move, I'd like to see the results. So top data modernization challenge is data quality. And I think second comes with disparate data sources or data sprawl, which I think could relate to data lakes issue as well. It's interesting that open source is not an issue. I guess either people have really nicely integrated open source tools, or they are not working with open source tools in this context. Alan, what do you think about the results?
By the way, I picked data quality as well. So yes, generally speaking, I think the open source tools is actually not the biggest concern for most of us, I think. Yeah. Data quality always ranked the highest in terms of the information being captured from the very first point of contact with the person or the customer. That's going through, like the systems, the data workflow, the transformation, then to the reporting side, and then to the analytics, where the data would be fed into like machine learning or AI models. Yeah. So data quality is an issue. It has always been an issue for us to continuously improve the data quality of the data sets. Having said that, I think there are now, I think, a lot of tools and validations being put in place that could help strengthen those data quality issues. But also on the social data side, where we have seen like people using fake robots, for example. Those would create a data quality issue and data bias in the data set as well. So they are also, when we consider like the model and algorithms that we have to kind of tackle those kind of data quality issues in a smarter way in terms of how we can get better results and better outcomes from those models.
Thanks. It's interesting that you meant people chose data quality. I actually added that option because the whole point of data modernization was to address the big issue about data quality. So my question then, and this goes to a point that one of our audience raised, managing data from different data structures within different applications. Data modernization, it's supposed to solve a lot of this data integration, data management, data quality issues. Are we getting it worse or is it getting better? Maybe Philipp, you can answer that.
I would say it's getting more powerful. And with that power, obviously, initially there comes some complexity. If you look at, I think there's this statistic and it says something like in the last 2 years, we have created more data in the entire human history. That's the kind of change we're looking at, which is extremely fundamental. So obviously, also there might be some comparisons to IT in the 90s. Before we had really some things like the structured query language really fleshed out to the degree where it is today, right? If you think about using a tool like that, you can literally learn that in maybe a day if you take a time. So back in the early days, that was incredibly complicated. And I think we're kind of seeing the same journey now where initially we get more power. Within more power, there come bigger challenges because we have higher opportunities, obviously much more data, crazy formats, right? Who had images in their database just a few years ago, where suddenly that becomes part of core business processes suddenly, these unusual kinds of data. But one very interesting concept I saw is really the amalgamation of many different streams together. So for example, the new concept of lake house, right? Where we have the advantages of the data warehouse and the data lake coming together, because obviously the data lake in itself is great, everything's in one place, but it's kind of hard to make that a golden standard of data because you literally just throw stuff in. Whereas if you impose a little bit of structure, suddenly we come to that point where we again say, okay, we refine that crude oil data into something that's actually valuable, right? And certainly having more crude is important, but also being able to then refine that extended amount of oil is also important to be able to make a value for the customer from it, right? So from that point, I know everyone gets overwhelmed by this. We all spend, especially and the better your team is, by the way, the more time you will spend on enhancing, enriching data and on deploying your models. Because if your team is great, you don't have to spend much time on thinking through many of the strategic pieces like building the actual AI model and all that, right? If you have the skills already, that's much faster suddenly. So from that point, if you despair on that, I would actually encourage you and say, okay, two things are there. One is it's a sign that your team is actually doing well and pushing in the right things. The other is we see that improves. And in just a few years, we will look back and say, wow, to be able to be part of that time where for the first time, we really did that. And we kind of learned it the hard way, but that really pushes you to achieve a much better level, right? So even when the technology gets more and more unified, being able to learn it nowadays is actually a privilege in itself.
Thanks, Philipp. Sue, you, Alan, do you have thoughts on that as well? Life getting better, life getting worse?
Maybe I start on that. I would say we are in a stage that we have to actively educate the decision maker, especially the senior management. So we all know that we are going through the digitalization. So everyone talks about that. Is it a buzzword or not? Doesn't matter. But the problem is that like right now, they have high expectation from especially the data team that they will drive something out. But we all know that the problem is here. So we have a lot of data in our business, but the problem is that we can't really easily transform the data into some very valuable business stuff. That's the disconnect we have. So we all know that we need to have the resources to hire people, we need the time to do that, but not all the management will think in this way. So it takes quite a lot of time for us to educate them. We have a joke saying that every AI project we have only 5% is really doing AI. So the rest is more talking about how we can get the approval from the management, how we get the budget, how we get the time. So everything is local. So I think that's the situation we are right now. Yeah.
It's an interesting point to you, and I like to ask Alan, why is there a disconnect? We all do know that AI takes time to learn. You do know that we need to find ways and means to whatever learning method that you're going to use to build the right model. But why do people want instantaneous results?
Well, I think coming from a business perspective, it is more about using data for evidence-based, better informed decision making. That's probably the ultimate goal in most instances. And that needs to be aligned with the business strategy. So I would say that the business use case is very important in terms of driving this forward. Having said that, I think in terms of a lot of the issue, it's where organization, they all structure differently. And sometimes, obviously, there will be silos. Silos in terms of the team may be using different types of systems to capture different types of data. But ultimately, it is the single source of truth that we've been talking about that would feed into the having the better decision making.
Yeah. Okay, I'd like to go to another poll questions because we are going to switch gear here to a big part of data modernization, which is data governance. And please bring out poll number 2 for the audience. So simple questions: who drives your data governance in your company? And can be honest, we all do know maybe the first 3 will be the suspects, but just like to see how that is shifting. So please do answer that. And I will come back to you on the results. Siyu, I want to know, in terms of having data governance in place, when you want to do, or you want to engage with third-party data, how strict a data governance do you need? Because integrating with third-party data, it can be a sort of a fluid situation, because there is obviously a negotiation process and depends on how you're going to get the data sources. The next thing you do not want to do is go back to say, yeah, but you need to put it in this certain data structure before you send it to me. So where does governance comes in, or does governance comes in right up front?
For me, we start to look at it at more like a data privacy and protection viewpoint. So because it is something quite old, so we already have this kind of data governance framework on top of that. So the first point of the way we think that is, we see that is an anti-privacy issue in that. It's quite tricky because for third-party data, it is not that straightforward that is it compiled to some kind of old standard, I would say, because we are not building that governance based on what we think about the third data at the very beginning. But we still try to utilize that. I will give you some quite practical example. Like when we look into some customer data from third party, we'll think that is that something that actually that vendor will violate the privacy issue? Because we know that we are quite strict on looking into the privacy issue on the first party data, but not the third party data. So we have to do some kind of DD on that vendor. Is that when they provide the data, so do they have the consent of the customer? So that's one of the real point we'll look into when talking about data governance on third-party data.
Okay. Philip and Alan, I just want to expand on that in terms of looking at it from a privacy. Does ethics matter? Or does it increasingly matter now? Maybe Alan, you can start on that.
Yes, it does matter. And when we talk about data governance, we obviously we look at both from an external perspective, but also internal perspective as well. So externally, of course, what matters most would be following the privacy or personal data collection law and regulations in different markets. And internally, then of course would be how we are using the data, in terms of how we are collecting data with the consents from our customer, but also being transparent in terms of how the data actually being used as well, as much as possible. I think that comes to the ethics question, right? That we're being open and honest in terms of the usage of the customer data, being ethical in terms of usage. In the NGO sector, I think it's probably easier that we don't actually sell data. So it probably would be more strictly follow in the sense that we don't break too many rules there. Yeah, but I guess there's a lot of argument, obviously, in the public commercial sector in terms of the value of customer data, perhaps.
Maybe Philip, you can add in your argument for that.
Yeah, sure, Winston. I mean, remember back a little bit in the discussion we had today, we were talking also about the doctor who has one preference versus the AI algorithm who might be equally good, but reflects a different preference. That is really ethics. And that this came up in the discussion is not a coincidence, because really ethics, that's one of the key differences between how you operate on an engineering type project, right? And then in a corporate setting, that's typically software engineering, where things are fairly assumed to be fairly deterministic. Versus if now you work in the kind of new world where we're in, and you go all the way, maybe even to AI or somewhere close to it, the key difference then suddenly is you allow for randomness, right? And randomness inherently brings these ethical points with it, right? And yes, there are even ethics on top of the ethics here, because then if you never ask the customer for consent or make it transparent that data is used in a certain way, do we feel well with that? And most people would intuitively say, I would prefer that the consumer at least knows. If I could get that for free, I would prefer, right? Even hardcore data people typically come to that value decision. Now, when we come back to the underlying ethics in making decisions in a random space, that's very interesting, actually, that it is a topic that was surprisingly long discussed. So we have in fields like philosophy even, we had discussions on this literally for hundreds of years. And essentially the crew of this whole thing boils down to, if you want to take any decision, you have to discriminate against someone, right? And obviously we know the word discriminate in the sense of maybe discriminating a person unfair because of certain characteristics. But discriminate also means that you actually put things into different buckets to make optimal decisions, right? So from that point, you need to be aware that by definition, you have much more ethical things. And that's really the human value that AI brings, and in a sense, the creativity that AI brings, because creativity always comes from restrictions as well. And in a sense, these ethical decisions that we have to take are certain decisions as well. And I think that's one of the things we always get most proud of, that when we see an organization gets really good at doing AI and all the things around it, suddenly we see that seemingly mathematical thing, seemingly very strict thing, actually makes people much more creative and human, right?
Okay, that's a good point. And I'd like to raise a subject that was highlighted in an article that my colleague Paul Ma wrote, where you have training sets that were already biased to a certain extent. In that context, what happens? Because you have no control, you have already enriched your data sets, you're already using that model, but then you find out that it's already intrinsically biased. And so there's an ethical issue. How do you go about it? Maybe see you, if that's the question, how do you actually, what are the actions you're going to take?
To me, I think the answer is quite simple. So even not talk about bias training data set, even if we say we have a non-biased training data set, but it turns out that the model we have trained it and we do some kind of testing on that, to see that if the decision based on that model is some kind of bias, we have to redo that. So I think that's a simple question to me. So whenever we have a model that has a bias result, we have to redo it or we have to just push it away.
Alan, would you push it away? It's an expensive proposition, actually.
Not entirely pushing it away, but we do look at different samples. And sometimes I think with those kind of bias, it's obvious that we will then have to either take out some of the anomalies from those data points, or we actually have to collect some extra data points as well to kind of smooth out some of those bias. But usually not entirely to just dump it away and then redo it again, perhaps.
Philip?
Yeah, I would say I would try not to push the model away completely, right? The more important thing from my point of view would be to say, we need to find the point where we feel comfortable with, where it reflects our preferences, our values as a company, and also the values that customers expect from us, right? Once we have that sorted, typically on a technical level, you can quickly remediate biases, right? Even in the very worst case, you just write a rule into your IT system that says, if this is the outcome from the model, just reduce the probability by X, right? There was one case that got really viral a few years ago where a company was offering an image recognition and people could try it out. And the data was biased towards the skin type in this case. And quite a few people that, let me say this carefully, that did not look as pale as a vampire, they got a very unfortunate result. Now the company saw that this got a lot of press attention, and literally within a day, the model outcome was changed. Right, I think in a day they can't even re-estimate the model unless they're really pushing their people. And what you can really do is to say, okay, if the outcome is a specific animal, just ignore and go with the second recommendation, something like that, right? So from a point, typically once you know what you want to have, once you know your preferences on a technical level, we tend to be able to find tools. And there's things like, if you want to go all the way, you could say, okay, I'm going to take something like a Bayesian approach, where I just don't look at only the center of distributions, but I also look at the whole distributions, and then I can do a much easier bias correction, also by just using different priors and all these things, right? So from that point, I would worry less about the technical restrictions here. If you have good people, that's something you can sort out typically really, really fast. I would more focus on what is it really we want.
Thanks. I'd like to bring out the results for I'd like to see who is actually leading data governance. That's interesting. So the CIOs and the chief data officers are actually driving the data governance function. It's sort of evolved from compliance used to, and the finance department used to have the best use case to drive data modernization, or actually data governance as well. Quick thoughts, since we are reaching time. Alan, what about the results? Does that surprise you? You agree?
Those results doesn't surprise me. I think there are reasons why that kind of data governance functions would sit more with either the CIO function or the CDO function on a more day-to-day basis. But in some markets, from my experience, some markets actually have the designated chief privacy officer role that needs to be appointed to someone within the organization. And in those instances, probably would be probably the chief executive, perhaps. So it depends on the regulations. It depends on the organization structure, I think. But generally speaking, data governance, my personal view is that you do need to have it sitting with a more day-to-day function in order to drive it. But then there will always be, I guess, all the functions where it will actually audit those kind of data governance or privacy issues as an independent kind of advice to provide that kind of recommendation back to to either the CDO or the CIO in terms of running their data governance.
Thank you, thank you. Siu, Philip, just wanted to know, usually, like say 5 years ago, tends to be the compliance department who's actually driving these projects. Is that shift, is that apparent? Siu first?
No, we are still compliance first. So we compliance still look after the data governance. To me, it kind of makes sense because we are talking about 3 line of defense model. The CDO is more the first line, while the compliance is the second line. So it's a good way to do a second location of duty. But I think maybe this is a new trend. Yeah.
Philip?
Let me first of all say I'm very pleased with the results we're seeing here because it reflects, in a sense, a better world. So same to Siu, we have both. We have a data privacy officer. We also have a chief data officer. And the difference is very similar to most places, that the chief data officer is able to acknowledge there is a trade-off. If you just say it's always just a risk to have data, to have it exposed, all that, you can have a very, very hard time creating value for customers. And that's really why you collect the data in the first place. If you lock it into some super secure chest, then there is no value. In fact, there's cost for storing it, right? So from that point, I really see that having someone in charge and in charge of both sides of the trade-off makes sense. Someone who can be tough and say, okay, we need to do this in the interest of the customer. We need to protect the data. But someone who also has an interest that the teams that actually build the solutions are enabled and are properly consulted instead of just blocked. So from that point, as I say, certainly a very good development we're seeing.
Okay. Thank you. And first of all, I'd like to thank all our panelists, Philip, Siu, Alan Chan. Real bang up job. Thanks for all your opinions. And I'm sure we could have conversed a bit longer on a lot more other subjects, but glad to have your opinions. And on behalf of Click, we also like to thank the audience for actually being with us and joining us for all this. Now I'd like to turn it over to Jonathan, who will have some remarks of his own and his closing endnotes.
Great. Thanks very much, Winston. And thanks so much to Philip, Siu, and Alan for those great insights. I mean, it's nice to see some real actionable results that you have right now, as opposed to just talking about what you're trying to do. And it is a very big change just from 15 to 18 months ago. So very exciting to see, actually. This is our 5th Digi-Live Summit. We launched these, with the pandemic and so forth. And, we've really been able to take some deeper dives on some interesting topics. And we try to improve these by getting your feedback. So if you could take a moment when you shut down, the poll will come up. It's about 5 questions, and we just like your feedback on what you'd like to see in the future, what you enjoyed today, what we could improve. We do look at these because it's important for us to help drive these events forward. We also do have an event coming up in Hong Kong and Macau for your colleagues in the HR department, and for those of you who are hiring in your digital and data departments and onboarding new staff. It's on May 27. It's about bringing the fragmented workforce together. That should be a very interesting discussion. We have a leading HR strategist joining us from the UK who'll be talking about that as well. So if you did enjoy this today, then please encourage your HR colleagues or maybe yourself to join this event next month as well. That's about it from me. And I just wanted to thank Winston for moderating, and again to all of the panelists and to our enabling sponsor, Click. They really do have some great solutions. So if you are looking at some next steps, please do reach out to Click as well. Well, that's it for today, and thanks so much for your time. I hope to see you at a future event of ours. Goodbye.